One of the civilizations that has most influenced the shaping of the so-called Western world is, without a doubt, ancient Greece. A people of inventors, thinkers, navigators, and rulers. In a land bathed by the waters of the Mediterranean Sea and outlined by mythological temples and mountainous vineyards, they created throughout their existence an entire worldview that, despite the passage of time, has endured to this day. Join us to explore the history of ancient Greece, its origins, its evolution, and the cultural legacy it left to the Western world and all of humanity.
Mi nombre es Alessandro Polentino y esta es la nueva enciclopedia. Pero antes de empezar con la historia de hoy, queremos invitarles a que apoyen nuestro canal, a que se suscriban, a que dejen su me gusta, a que dejen sus comentarios que los leemos todos, a que compartan nuestros videos con cada uno de sus amigos y a que activen las notificaciones para no perderse de ninguna de nuestras próximas entregas.
Without further ado, let's begin today's story. Before we begin telling the story of ancient Greece, it's important to make a few clarifications. The first of these is that the term ancient Greece refers to the historical period of Greek culture that spans from 1200 BC to 31 BC, the year when the Hellenic cultural sphere was conquered by the Roman Empire after the Battle of Actium, ending Greece's influence as a civilization and turning its territories into provinces of the Roman Republic. This period of ancient Greece is divided into several stages, namely the Dark Age, the Archaic Age, the Classical Age, and the Hellenistic Age, during which the different degrees of development of the Greek people and culture can be observed. The second clarification is that when we talk about ancient Greece, we are referring to the historical period just described of the so-called Hellenic people, which we will discuss later. The Hellenic people originally inhabited the territory they called Hellas, a geographical term that the Romans would later replace with the name Greece, which included the territory of the Balkan Peninsula, the coasts of Asia Minor, that is, present-day Turkey, and all the islands of the Aegean Sea. It is in this land, characterized by its mountainous terrain, sunny climate, and the imposing Mediterranean Sea, that the Hellenic peoples would go on to forge their own history. Several archaeological findings dating back to 7000 BC confirm the existence of indigenous human groups settled in what is now Greece, who developed agriculture and some basic political institutions. However, successive migrations to Greek territory changed its makeup and marked the beginning of the formation of the Hellenic people proper. Initially, these were tribes coming from Northern Europe, that is, Indo-Europeans, who settled in Greece and mixed with the indigenous populations, introducing important elements such as the horse, war chariots, several basic social structures, and the first linguistic signs which would become the root of the Greek language. Meanwhile, around the year 3000 BC, a civilization arose on the island of Crete that has been called the Minoan civilization. Although they were not Greeks in the strict sense, the Minoans played a fundamental role in the emergence of the cultural elements representative of the Hellenic people, such as maritime trade, palace architecture, the worship of fertility gods, sacred bulls, and the emergence of the first mythological stories like the Minotaur. Such was the level of development reached by the Minoans that they are considered the first urban civilization in all of Europe. Shortly after, around the year 1600 BC, a new civilization emerged on the Greek mainland, specifically in the cities of Mycenae and Tiryns. A civilization known as the Mycenaean civilization, which coexisted and traded with the Minoan civilization and absorbed several of the Minoan elements just described, spreading them throughout mainland Greece. Eventually, around the year 1450 BC, the Mycenaeans prevailed over the Minoans, taking control of Crete and expanding Mycenaean culture throughout the Aegean Sea. The Mycenaeans, building on the urban and cultural foundation of the Minoans, enriched writing. They developed a hierarchical social structure based on warrior kings, who ruled cities where constructions such as Cyclopean walls and megarons were built. And these cities based their economy on a palace-centered system of redistribution of goods, obtained mainly through trade with regions such as Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant. Their main specialties were ceramics, olive oil, and some metals. On the other hand, the Minoans developed the earliest forms of worship of several deities that would later become part of the Greek Olympian pantheon, such as the gods Zeus and Poseidon. However, around the year 1100 BC, the Mycenaean civilization declined due to many factors, among them invasions by northern peoples and seaborne invasions, such as those by the so-called Sea Peoples, internal military conflicts, apparent natural disasters, and the eventual decline of the economy. As a result, the city's populations decrease, and for a time, all written records from this period even disappear. The decline of Mycenaean civilization, which coincides with the general end of the Bronze Age, marks the beginning of the so-called Dark Age, a period that, although ruinous, is important for the shaping of ancient Greece. The so-called Dark Age of ancient Greece covers a period of time from around 1100 BC to 800 BC. As we mentioned, the Dark Age is a period of complete decline. The previous maritime trade is reduced to mere local trade. Agriculture and livestock farming are abruptly reduced, barely sustained by slaves and day laborers. Craftsmanship and architecture lose the splendor reached during Mycenaean times, and even during this dark era, there are no records of large-scale political organizations like those of the Mycenaeans. The population remained isolated in small, self-sustaining communities. During this same dark era, at the end of the 13th century BC, several Indo-European human groups began to make incursions into Greece, which, thanks to intermixing, led to the formation of the four tribes that would later shape the Hellenic people. The first will be the Dorians in places like the Peloponnese, Crete, and southern Greece. Then come the Ionians, settled in Attica, on several islands of the Aegean Sea, and in Asia Minor. After that, we have the Aeolians, present in Thessaly, Lesbos, and Aeolus, and finally the Achaeans, who are the heirs of the extinct Mycenaean civilization. Each of these tribes or groups had their own distinctive features. For example, the Dorians, warlike and austere, will have as their greatest representative the warrior city of Sparta. For their part, the Ionians, curious and open to trade, will be the tribe from which the first philosophers emerged, such as Thales of Miletus, Anaximander, and Heraclitus. And the Aeolians will be lyric poets and singers of ancient oral traditions. In this sense, although some historians have quite literally regarded this period as a dark age due to the disappearance of the Mycenaean civilization, others, like the American Ralph Turner, point out that in this era of decline and migration, two key events take place. The first of these is that, due to the Indo-European influence, the Hellenic people acquire very distinct characteristics: fair skin, black or sometimes brown hair, and green or brown eyes. Regarding the physical constitution of the Greeks, both archaeological evidence and oral tradition suggest that they must have had an admirable athletic build. Because of their rural lifestyle, combined with a diet based mainly on products like wine, fish, olive oil, and grains. The second important development of the Dark Age is that, during this period, the Hellenic peoples forged a single cultural tradition, made up of both the distant contributions of the Mycenaeans and the contributions of the Indo-European immigrants, shaping classical Greek culture. It's no coincidence that this Greek cultural tradition is documented in poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey, works that, although composed many years later by the poet Homer, narrate events that did take place during the Dark Age, such as the Trojan War and the journey of Odysseus. Thus, the apparent decline of the Dark Age actually foreshadows an upcoming renaissance for the Hellenic people. This period of resurgence for ancient Greece is known as the Archaic Age and spans from 800 BC to around 500 BC. The event that marks the beginning of the Archaic Age is the reappearance of writing in Greece, which had disappeared after the end of the Mycenaean civilization, around the year 800 BC, when the Greeks adopt the Phoenician alphabet and over time create the Greek alphabet. This allows the Greeks to transmit myths, legends, epic poetry, and in turn, to produce the first great literary works of the Greek world, which are the ones already mentioned, the Odyssey and the Iliad, where the Mycenaean past is given renewed importance and a common Greek identity is emphasized. At the same time, the first signs of philosophy emerge in this era, with figures such as Thales of Miletus, Anaximander, Parmenides, and Heraclitus, who reflect on the origin of things, the reason for the existence of things, and many other aspects. This fact has given the Greeks the distinction of being the inventors or discoverers of philosophy. On the other hand, because during the Dark Age the population had been reduced to small communities, these, as they began to grow again, started to organize themselves politically and economically into large city-states, autonomous and independent from each other, giving rise to the so-called Greek Polis. These polis originated not only from the resurgence of small communities, but also from various and continuous internal and external wars. Thus, although each one preserves an autonomy that makes them different, the common denominator of the polis is that they are initially ruled by a king belonging to the warrior aristocracy, which lives in the Acropolis. That is the upper part of the city, usually built on the top of a hill. Meanwhile, the artisans, laborers, and slaves lived in the lower city, seeking the protection of the warrior aristocracy and helping to support them through their economic surpluses. The emergence of the polis is crucial for several events that take place during the Archaic Age, such as the rise of maritime trade, and with it, the minting of the first Greek coins, the flourishing of the economy and population, and the beginning of Greek colonization to regions such as Asia Minor, southern Italy, and the Aegean Sea. This was in search of new regions and fertile lands to which they eventually brought their culture, politics, and religion. At the same time, in terms of governance, the warrior monarchies in the polis were also being replaced by aristocratic oligarchies who owned the land and other means of production. This is an important step because in some polis, there was an increase in citizen participation, thanks to reforms by rulers such as Draco and Solon. Immediately, institutions such as the popular assembly called ecclesia and the councils called bulli were created, which included various sectors of the population. This will be an important precedent for aspects such as Athenian democracy and citizenship, which we will talk about later. However, it should be clarified that in other city-states, the so-called tyrants also rule, single leaders who hold power for their entire lives, often with the approval of the population. In areas such as religion, during the Archaic Age, the worship of the Olympian gods was institutionalized, such as Zeus, Athena, Apollo, and many others that emerged over the centuries through oral traditions dating back to Mycenaean times. At the same time, sanctuaries and religious festivals developed, reinforcing social cohesion. Greek religion became more organized and structured, with established rituals and lavish temples. In this sense, the Archaic Age, which represents a necessary stage in the later flourishing of ancient Greece, comes to an end with the so-called Persian Wars. For a long time, the Greek city-states were in constant conflict with each other, especially the city-states of Athens and Sparta, which were the most powerful ones. However, around the year 492 BC, faced with the threat of the Persian Empire, which had subjugated the Greeks in Asia Minor, the Greek city-states found it necessary to unite in order to avoid a possible Persian conquest. Thus, in battles such as Marathon in 490 BC and Salamis in 480 BC, the Greeks defeated the Persians, which not only allowed them to preserve their political independence, but also helped them forge a sense of unity and mutual trust. Thus, with a common identity and a strong religious, political, and economic culture, the Greeks moved toward what became known as the Classical Age. In this sense, historians usually place the beginning of the Classical Age around the year 500 BC, or more specifically, in 479 BC, with the victory of the Greeks over the Persians at the Battle of Plataea. Although it should be noted the conflict between the Greeks and the Persians would not end definitively until the year 449 BC. Thanks to the Polis of Athens and its Delian League, which was a political military union through which Athens and a large number of lesser polis definitively defeated the Persians and liberated regions occupied by them, such as Macedonia, Thrace, the islands of the Aegean Sea, and Ionia. In this sense, after the victory over the Persians, Athens became the political, cultural, and economic beacon of ancient Greece, exercising hegemony over the rest of the Polei. Thus, in politics, the Polei continued to be the preferred form of organization throughout Greece, with the forms of government varying in each one of them. However, uniquely in Athens, the so-called Athenian democracy emerged, where citizens, that is, only free men with full rights, actively participated in public decisions. Thanks to the reforms promoted by leaders like Pericles, this has been, for historians, one of the most famous aspects of ancient Greece, because it is the historical precedent that inspired the generations of the Enlightenment to drive movements like the French Revolution and establish direct democracy as the preferred form of government. As for the economy, thanks to the rise of Athens, it continued its steady growth since the Archaic Age. In this sense, Athens and the Delian League dominate maritime trade in the Aegean Sea, which allows them to accumulate a large economic surplus that makes it possible to finance major public works, cultural activities, and military forces. Among the social aspects of classical Greece, the social organization stands out, structured into three categories. First were the citizens, that is, free men with full political rights. Then there were the metics, that is, the foreigners, and finally the slaves. On the other hand, education and physical training were highly valued, especially in the Polis of Sparta, which is known for its strict military discipline and, as in the rest of Greece, for the celebration of the famous Olympic Games. The Olympic Games in this classical era are an important athletic competition held every 4 years in the Polis of Olympia in honor of the god Zeus, Lord of Thunder in Greek mythology. In these games, only free men from all the Greek polis can participate, as women and foreigners are excluded. These games have a strong religious and social component, as they included rituals, the Olympic truce to guarantee safety during the event, and served to reinforce the cultural identity of the polis. The Olympic events included various disciplines such as races, wrestling, pentathlon, and boxing, and the winners received an olive wreath and great prestige, both personally and for the polis they represented. Organized under strict rules and supervised by judges, the Olympic Games were much more than just a sporting event, as they represented a cultural phenomenon that temporarily united the Greek polis in peace and celebration. Polytheistic religion in this classical age still permeates all areas of social life through festivals, rituals, and cults dedicated to multiple anthropomorphic and mythological gods. On the other hand, the role of women varies depending on the polis, but generally their participation in public life is limited, mostly centered on the home and family. However, one of the main reasons this classical era is among the best remembered periods of ancient Greece is its cultural flourishing, because this period saw foundational figures such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle exploring topics such as knowledge, ethics, and politics. Meanwhile, architecture produces masterpieces like the Parthenon, using the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian styles, which are so representative of this era. At the same time, theater flourishes with playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides in tragedy, and Aristophanes in comedy. Meanwhile, historical literature, through Herodotus and Thucydides, advances alongside mathematical science and physics, with Euclid and Pythagoras. Meanwhile, art seeks harmony, proportion, and balance, reflected through ideals of beauty and perfection in statues like the Athena Parthenos. However, this great Athenian heyday soon comes to an end. The very supremacy of Athens and its imperial policies with the other city-states relegates Sparta to a secondary position. In view of these suspicions, the so-called Peloponnesian War begins in 431 BC. This war is quite intermittent, but it ends with the decline of Athens at the hands of Sparta, which establishes itself as the new dominant city-state in Greece in 404 BC. However, Spartan hegemony lasts only a short time, as they are defeated by the city-state of Thebes at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, making Thebes the most influential city-state in Greece. However, due to the general situation in Greece, Thebes and other city-states such as Athens, Argos, and Corinth decline both economically and politically. This situation of weakness in Greece is skillfully taken advantage of by the Kingdom of Macedonia, whose rich history deserves a separate video. This kingdom, located to the north of Greece, although it has Hellenic linguistic and cultural roots, unlike the Greek city-states, was indeed a properly unified monarchy and was politically opposed to the Greek city-states. In this sense, the Macedonians, led by Philip II, invaded the Greek city-states and took control of them in 338 BC with the Battle of Chaeronea. Philip II forces the Greek city-states to vote and join the so-called League of Corinth, a kind of political military federation that, without undermining the autonomy of the city-states, unites them to face the Persian Empire, which once again intends to conquer Greece. This unification of the city-states under the Macedonian kingdom has two implications. On one hand, it stops the internal wars between the city-states and unites them against a common enemy, thus strengthening the common Greek identity of the city-states. However, after the death of Philip II in 336 BC, one of the greatest and most admired figures in all of world history comes onto the scene: his son Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great continues the war against the Persians, finally defeating them in 331 BC and annexing the Persian Empire to Macedonia, becoming at a young age the greatest conqueror of his time. However, Alexander does not live for long, and after several conquests, he dies at the age of 32 in 323 BC. The death of Alexander the Great marks the end of the classical age and the beginning of what is known as the Hellenistic age, in which Greek culture, which had already been at its peak for some time, becomes even richer, reaching its full development, but under very particular geopolitical conditions. The death of Alexander the Great, which marks the beginning of the Hellenistic age, profoundly changes the destiny of Greece. If during the rule of Alexander the Great, Macedonia became a vast territory stretching from Greece to the northeast of India, after his death in 331 BC, the empire became Hellenistic under the Diadochi. The Diadochi, which means successors in Greek, took over and divided the empire among themselves.
Repartirse todos los territorios de
331 BC marked the start of the Hellenistic age during the wars of the Diadochi. Thus, the Macedonian Empire was gradually broken up into kingdoms such as Macedonia, which included present-day Greece, the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid kingdom in Asia, and many others that became known as the Hellenistic kingdoms. As for the Greek city-states, being far inferior to the rest of the Hellenistic kingdoms, they remained indirectly subject to their power. However, what is truly remarkable about this Hellenistic age is that even though the city-states, which were the cradle of Hellenistic culture, were relegated to a secondary role, this did not lead to the disappearance of Hellenic culture, but rather ushered in a new era. In this sense, during the Hellenistic age, Hellenic culture and all things Hellenic transcended the borders of the city-states and spread throughout all the kingdoms that emerged after the death of Alexander the Great and the division of his empire among his lieutenants. For these kingdoms, although politically opposed and even at war with each other during this period, remained under a strong Greek cultural influence, promoting the Greek language, customs, and institutions within their own territories. Thus, in the new Hellenistic kingdoms, the ruling elite and Greek settlers mixed with the local populations, creating a fusion of traditions that gave rise to a hybrid culture which, although Eastern, was predominantly Greek in official, intellectual, and artistic aspects. In this context, the cities founded by Alexander and his successors, such as Fabriano,
su caso Alejandría en Egipto,
became centers of cultural exchange, where Greek science, arts, philosophy, and literature flourished under the influence of the native Eastern culture. For its part in the economic sphere, the now Hellenistic culture experienced remarkable growth, favored by monetary unification and increased trade. The circulation of silver coins, such as staters and drachmas, facilitated commercial exchange in various areas of Europe, Asia, and Africa. This made the great cities founded by the Hellenistic kings, such as the already mentioned Alexandria, Pergamon, and Antioch, become important economic, cultural, and artisanal production centers. Maritime and land trade prospered, thanks to an extensive network of routes, and the wealth obtained made it possible to finance large urban projects, including temples, theaters, and libraries, whose ruins persist to this day. These cities enjoy great economic autonomy and are key points for the circulation of capital, facilitating both state and private sponsorship of culture and the maintenance of professional armies. For its part, in the cultural sphere, the Hellenistic age represents, as we have said, a combination and fusion of Greek traditions with Eastern customs and religions, giving rise to a remarkable cultural and religious syncretism. In art, for example, there is a notable evolution from the classical heroic idealism championed by the exaltation of heroes, such as Heracles or Achilles, toward an expressive realism that reflects a variety of emotions and more naturalistic representations of everyday life. Outstanding examples of this movement include the Pergamon altar, dated between 180 and 160 BC, and the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, which dates back to 350 BC, considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. For its part, architecture is maintained and continues the perfection of the classical styles, called Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, which are adopted for large urban projects and modern public spaces for the time, such as temples and theaters. The stoas, which were well-decorated colonnades or porticos. The agoras, which were squares surrounded by galleries. The gymnasiums, which were spaces for physical and intellectual training. The palaestras, which were areas for wrestling entertainment. And the stadiums, which were sports venues for competitions. For its part, Hellenistic philosophy evolves to respond to uncertainties and social changes, focusing on pragmatic and ethical schools, like Stoicism, founded by Zenon of Citium around the year 300 BC, also like Epicureanism, founded by Epicurus around the year 307 BC, and skepticism, all of which seek personal happiness and tranquility in a fragmented and complex world. On the other hand, in the sciences, the production of scientific knowledge flourished in academic centers, such as the Library and Museum of Alexandria, with figures like Euclid in mathematics, Archimedes in physics and mathematics, and Eratosthenes in geography. In turn, in literature, the so-called New Comedy appears, represented by authors like Menander, and with comedies such as Dyskolos, Samia, and Epitropontes. On the other hand, in Hellenistic religion, cultural syncretism, one of the most important features of earlier ages, is also reflected. Incorporating deities of Eastern origin into the Greek pantheon, such as Serapis and Isis, and consolidating new cults that reflect the cultural diversity of these empires. These advances of Hellenistic culture, although they led it to achieve the civilizational milestones for which it is known today, also mark some of the reasons why Hellenic culture began to decline in the following centuries. In this sense, the final stage of the period of Greek antiquity is the so-called Roman Greece. Although in this period the political existence of the kingdoms of the Hellenistic age comes to an end, this does not mean that the Hellenistic cultural influence ceased. In fact, it was quite the opposite. While Greek antiquity was developing, over the centuries, a powerful urban civilization also began to emerge in the heart of the Italian peninsula. We're talking about Rome, which over time would become the largest empire in human history up to that point, and whose long history deserves a separate video. In the final years of Greek antiquity, Rome existed under the name of the Roman Republic. In this sense, since the 2nd century BC, Rome was undergoing a process of expansion and growth aimed at consolidating a vast empire. This is evident in the so-called Punic Wars, which lasted from 264 BC to 146 BC, in which Rome overwhelmingly defeated Carthage, one of the most powerful civilizations in the Mediterranean. In this sense, Rome began to invade the Hellenic kingdoms starting in 200 BC, when the so-called Macedonian Wars began. These wars began during a period of great instability within the Hellenic kingdoms and the Greek city-states, entities that were also in constant conflict with each other, which is why their armies were completely weakened. In this sense, Rome saw a Hellenic world that was militarily and politically fragile, and that would soon fall under its control. The first entity of the Hellenic world to fall under Roman power was Macedonia, which, after several years of Roman military and political influence, was turned into a Roman province in the year 168 BC, after the Roman victory at the Battle of Pydna. With Macedonia taken, a strategic point for the control of the eastern Mediterranean, the next to fall under Roman power were the Greek Polis. The Greek Polis united militarily in the Achaean League, which were defeated by Rome at the Battle of Corinth in 146 BC, and were incorporated into the Republic under the name Province of Achaia. This event marks the end of the historic autonomy and independence of the Polis, the cradle of Hellenic culture, which now become part of the Roman Republic. Next, the Romans continued with the conquest of Syria and Asia Minor, displacing Seleucid Hellenistic rule through the so-called Mithridatic Wars, which lasted from 135 BC to 63 BC. When Pompey arrived, he conquered the territory of Syria and incorporated it into the Roman Republic. Finally, in 31 BC, Rome took control of the Ptolemaic kingdom, that is, the north of Egypt and the Nile River basin, after defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra VII in the naval battle of Actium. That territory then became another Roman province. With this territorial incorporation, Rome, already in control of Macedonia, the Polis, Asia Minor, and Syria, took control of the entire ancient Hellenic cultural area and the whole eastern Mediterranean. Thus, after more than 1,200 years of Hellenic or Greek cultural tradition, it comes to an end. However, this does not mean that Hellenic culture was suddenly wiped out, but quite the opposite. The Romans, faithful admirers of Greek antiquity, continued the Hellenic cultural tradition in such a way that they are, in many respects, considered a continuation and refinement of Hellenic culture. In particular, the Roman elite of the time, who openly admired Greek culture, actively adopted Greek knowledge, arts, philosophy, and aesthetics, giving rise to a process in which Rome is, according to experts, culturally conquered by Greece. This phenomenon is evident in many areas. For example, in education and thought, Greek culture becomes a fundamental pillar of Roman education. Prominent Romans like Scipio Aemilianus deeply value Greek education, surrounding themselves with books, sculptures, and Hellenic philosophers. In fact, the Greek language becomes an essential language in the education of the elites and in Roman cultural administration, facilitating the transmission of controversial knowledge. On the other hand, in art and architecture, Rome takes Greek aesthetics as a faithful model, copying and adapting classical sculptures and using the classical architectural orders, that is, the unforgettable Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian styles, combining them with their own technical innovations, such as the use of concrete and vaults. Iconic examples of this cultural fusion are constructions like the Roman Pantheon, which integrates Roman engineering with Greek design. For their part, in the religious and mythological sphere, Rome adopts the Greek pantheon, identifying their own deities with the Greek gods. For example, Jupiter is identified with Zeus or Venus with Aphrodite, so that Greek mythology becomes integrated into Roman education and popular culture. Roman poets like Virgil and Ovid reinterpret and spread these mythological stories in a new context, creating a hybrid Greco-Roman mythology. The daily life of the Romans also reflects this growing Greek influence, in aspects ranging from the decoration of villas with frescoes and mosaics of Greek themes, to the appropriation of literary and theatrical models developed in the finest periods of ancient Greece. For their part, the rich Hellenistic philosophy, especially in schools like Stoicism, finds great acceptance among the Roman elite, influencing ethics, political thought, and social practices for many years. Due to philosophy's influence, Rome adopts many Greek elements. This does not mean that they simply copy them, but rather that once assimilated, they reinterpret and adapt them to their own pre-established values and needs, forging a Greco-Roman cultural synthesis that endures for centuries and ultimately becomes the foundation of the culture of the Roman Empire.
Y posteriormente de toda la civilización occidental.
Thus, the period of ancient Greece constitutes a fundamental stage in the formation of Western culture, with elements in all areas of human life that continue to be of vital importance in the modern world today. Dear friends, thank you for watching until the end. We hope you enjoyed the video. Your support is vital to this project's growth. That's why we invite you to leave a like, leave your comment, subscribe, share our content with all your friends, and stay tuned for upcoming releases. See you next time.